was I was born in 1934, and so when Pearl Harbor occurred, I was 7 years old, and I remember it very well. That's something you don't forget very much. But that gives you an idea. It was just a farm, a small farm, that, well, I was born in a shed, more than a farm, out in the field. My parents, I'm the first of 6 children, and my parents were living on that farm as he started throwing. But shortly, I only know that because I was told by my parents that that shanty out there in the middle of a field is where you were born. Interesting, but I'm glad I don't remember. My parents lived on a farm near my grandparents for the first 4 years of my life, and then we moved to the farm. It was a little bigger farm that I lived the rest of the time I was at home until I graduated from high school. I have a picture of the farm that we moved to when I was 4 years old. I'm just going to pass this around, and you can just adjust it. The barn, the hen house, the chicken house, the pig house, you know, that's a rather typical small farm in the Midwest. My grandfather and grandpa and grandma lived on a farm closer to where I was born, but my dad would go help him haul bundles for threshing. And this is a picture that some passing minister was going down the road and met my dad and grandpa coming back. That's standing up on this load of soybean bundles is my grandpa, Arthur Sisson, and sitting down there is Vic Sisson. That's my dad. So I wanted to show you those. I went to college. Well, I went to a small high school. After I finally finished the first schoolhouse that I attended, it took 8 years to do that. One room, I was in one room for 8 years, and had 5 or 6 people. When I was an 8th grader and graduated, there were 7 students in the 8 grades, and 3 of them were my younger siblings, and 1 was a cousin who lived there. But I had a wonderful teacher, Mrs. Chafee, and she was really great. I remember that when I went to college and took some English classes, I didn't learn anything after I had, it was the same stuff that I'd already had, but I was in grade school. So, and she lived in a nearby town, and just a few years ago, it's after we were living here in Kaysville, that I learned that she was still alive. So I wrote her a letter, and she wrote back with the sweetest letter, that I was expressing my gratitude to her. So she died shortly thereafter. But it was a great experience. And then high school, I graduated with the largest class in the history of the school. There were 24 of us. My mom had graduated 20 years earlier. I think there were 11 in her class. But it had some advantages to me because I like sports. And there aren't very many people to play, so I got to play baseball in the spring and basketball in the winter and football in the fall. Football was 6-man football for the first, and then changed to 8-man football. So I never played 11-man football, but that was my background. And I was raised in a very Christian home. We always had family prayer and family scripture. We always went to church. Even in the evening church meetings, when they had prayer meetings and so forth, at this country church. It was a Lutheran church. So I was raised Lutheran, and I went to the Lutheran college. It was not too far away from Gustavus Adolphus College was its name. It's in St. Peter, Minnesota. And when I went to college, I didn't know what I was going to do. The only two things I could knew about as a three things: become a teacher, become a preacher, or become a doctor. And I wasn't really interested in the medical side, so I was leaning toward becoming a minister in the Lutheran church, and that's why I went to that college. But I found out as I was in the very first year, by the time that was over, I knew I didn't want to be a minister, because there were just, obviously a lot of young men. In those days, there weren't young women that were preparing for the ministry. That's changed, of course. But they were going to be ministers, but their reason for becoming a minister, in so many cases, was that it's such a cushy job, and you make good money. And I thought, is that motivation to become a minister in a church? And so I said, I think I've had it with that. Abandoned that and then switched into biology and later math and statistics. It's 4 years there, and then but I had to make my own money. But I was lucky enough to get a job in the cafeteria, and that was good because I got to know all the students. There were 1,100 students in the college, by the way. And when I graduated, just before I graduated, one of my instructors said, this was his speaking for himself, he says, I'm just finishing up my PhD at Iowa State University in entomology, and that's what he was teaching that. He said, if you'd like to go to graduate school, and I think you should, I think I can get you an assistantship, which he did. And so, as soon as I graduated, I went to Iowa State, and that became my graduate work. For 3 years, 2 years I got my master's, and then I was working my PhD about halfway through. And one day I was in the class taught by this head of the Department of Statistics at Iowa State, and he told me from the class, he says, would you stay after class? I want to talk to you. Well, that's not a good sign. And so, but I said, sure, not going to cross he's the department head to boot as well as the instructor. I'm not going to cross him. And so he said, there's a man who wants to come here to do a sabbatical leave here at Iowa State. And he's trying to find somebody to take his place for 1 year. And he said he's from Utah State University. Well, I'd never been to Utah. I'd been to Colorado because I sang in a choir that went on tour every year. So I've been that far, but never to out here. And I didn't know anything at all about the church, the Mormons, But that's not, I lie. I knew two things. One was Brigham Young. He's in all the history books. Of course you know about Brigham Young. And the other was polygamy. That was my knowledge bank when I came out to Utah. But I told him that first day, he says, no, I'm not interested. I've seen people come back to try to get their PhD after they were, dropped out to work for a little bit. By the time they got back, they were married with children and trying to support a family, and now they're trying to live on a graduate student assistantship, which is not a get-rich-quick scheme. It was challenging. So I said, I'm going to finish up my work and go. Now, I was single all this time. I did a lot of dating in college when I was an undergraduate, but when I got to graduate school in statistics, there was one woman who was majored in statistics, one young lady. So prospects were not good. But I was busy. I worked and I played intramural activities and so forth. But I said, no, I'm not interested. Well, he says, you think it over. And when you come back to class, this is a Wednesday class, Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. This is Wednesday. He says, when you come into class Friday, let me know. And, so I said, okay, that's fine. So I went back, and so I started calling my parents, and I talked to my major professor. I got word from the minister and his wife of the church back where I grew up in. You can imagine what kind of word I'd get there. And that's pretty much what I got from everybody. My major professor said, he says, you know, that's pretty tough to do. He says, and then in kind of a joking thing, but he says, that's up to you. And jokingly, he said, he had spent a year, or, well, more than that, at, I think it was Idaho State, working for the government, so he knew of that. He says, you know, what's gonna happen if you go out there is you're gonna find some cute little Mormon girl and come back married. And I laughed. No, I didn't know any cute little girl. Well, that's not true. All girls are cute, I'm sure, in reality. I don't want to lie. But nobody that was at the top of my list, you know. It comes to think of it, I didn't even have a list, so how could it be the top? I don't know. So, but they all said, don't go. And I got to thinking as I was getting ready to go to class that Friday, but this might be an interesting experience to see another part of the country, you know, and all that sort of thing. So I said, maybe I'll go. So I went and told him, yes, I'll go. So then the correspondence with this, he was the department head of statistics at Utah State. And so he would send me correspondence, the information and so forth. And as it turns out, all that correspondence, the typing and so forth, was done by the lady who became my wife. She was the secretary in the department and also a key punch operator in the lab. And there were about 6 young ladies who worked in the lab right across the hall from my office. She was one of them. So I packed up everything, went out, and I said, I was supposed to start 1st of July. That was a Monday. I got there on a Friday because I had to find a place to live, a room, which is what I got, a room with, in a basement of a house with 3 freshman boys. But they were good kids. They were kids though, you know, basically. But it was fine, no problems. But I said, I go up to the campus, find out where my office will be, and all this sort of thing. And so I went up there, and I came to the door. What are these two? Is it Dutch doors? Is that where the top opens up? Mm-hmm. And then, so it's you know, so it's like a counter. And so I came up to the counter, and I see all these I've forgotten how many, 6 maybe girls in there, and the lady who was in charge, and there was one young man who worked there, and he decided it was his job to take me under his wing and introduce you to all the people. So he did. He said, one by one, he took me along and said, this is so-and-so, and this is so-and-so, and he gave me a little bit of background. And when I first come out there, I noticed over on the side of the room over here, this young lady was standing beside the machine she was working with. And I thought, nice looking young lady. And so when we got to her, he introduced her. And then, you know, talk a little bit. And then, but when we left, he said, now, all these girls are single right now. But she said, one of them, Jean, to be my wife eventually, is waiting for a missionary. Well, I didn't even know what he's talking about. You know, waiting for a missionary. You know, so he explained to me, and he said, well, but you know, I just want to point out that sometimes people are kind of a little loose with that term. They kind of use that as a hedge against going with someone, you know. And it turned out that she was, but he said, she is waiting for a missionary. They will be married as soon as he gets back from South Africa. So, and as time went by, my office is right across the way, and they would be walking up, and I heard her a couple of times turn down a date from young men that were there. Well, she didn't exactly turn them down. What she basically said was, I'm waiting for a missionary, and we're going to be married. She had dated quite a bit before he went on his mission, and she said, now if you want to take me to a movie, it's your money, I don't care, but just want you to know that you're not investing anything here, you're just losing it, you know, that kind of thing. So yeah, that didn't help my morale. The what? Morale, thank you. When you get old, you forget everything. So, about this was in the fall, of course. Now we moved into the fall, and I had my office right across the hall from the workroom. They had to carry a lot of boxes of, well, the old IBM cards, and you girls don't know anything about that. None of us, you in the room, knows about IBM cards, punch cards. That was. You're way too young. So, but and also the printer boxes of printer paper that the printer would print out. We had to go down to the end of the hall for storage, and they were heavy. And I immediately recognized that there were that doesn't seem right. And I'm not sure why it was that Jean would seem to be the one she was, you know, the departmental secretary, so she had written letters to me for the department head. So I would do that, and we just visited, and we just got along very well, and very, very well actually. So in a couple of months that I'd been there, I knew that I was in love with this girl, and she's waiting for a missionary. This is not a tremendous scenario here. So finally, I wanted to ask her out and didn't dare, and I was chicken, you know. And bless their little hearts, big hearts, those three little boys in the basement were all the time on me. Said, but you know, they'd say, well, what's happening? Are you going to ask her out? No, and they were just egging me on. So it was lucky for me, at least, that they do it. So I finally got up the nerve to ask her to go to a movie, and she said, sure. So we went to a movie. Now this was in the fall. It was right at general conference time. And you know, that was a Friday night we went, and I've been talking to her. I said, you know, when I came into Logan, I came down through Bear Lake from the east, but I was too busy worried about mountain driving to really enjoy the scenery. So I'd like to see Bear Lake. Would you like to go for a ride to Bear Lake tomorrow? And she said, sure, why not? So we did, and we had the best talk. We talked very heavily about mixed marriages, religious mixed marriages. That can be a real challenge for most people. It is. And you know, I said, you know, it's like starting your wedding, your marriage, with a wedge in it already, that would be easy to split things apart. And the world is tough enough without that particular, problem in your way. So we just had a very good talk all the way up and down. I forgot one thing I wanted to go back. All those girls were really pests. They just kept after me. To me, don't you have a girl back in Iowa or Minnesota? No. Well, you must have dated somebody. Well, I hadn't for 3 years because I was in graduate school. So, but they were pretty relentless in giving me a bad time. So I also played softball when I was in the summer, and I would help coach a girls softball team. So I did meet some girls there. And it just so happened that I finally just said, well, maybe I'll ask one of the girls out. And I did on a Friday night. And the next day, at that time, the university work week was Monday through Friday, all day, and Saturday morning. So on Saturday morning, after that, we were working. So I went into the room for whatever reason I went in. I don't remember now. But they were talking, and we had hired a new girl as a keep lunch operator. So, but Jean now, that next morning, she came and she says, guess what I saw last night? She said, I saw Don out there driving down Main Street with a girl in the car. And she was just snugged up to him so tight, total lie. I shouldn't say that Jane was a liar, but I know one occasion when she was. She was not a liar, but she was teased or something, I guess. So she went on about this, and finally, I thought we got to get this conversation finished here. Or they do too. I'm not in the conversation, but I said to her, Jean, the girl you saw me with last night is your new keep lunch operator, sitting right here through this whole conversation. I felt bad for her. It was. I wouldn't have asked her out again anyhow. But at any rate, Jean was so embarrassed, and well, she should have been. So, but the next day, then we went up to Bear Lake. On the way home, I said, we had such a good time. I said, would you like to go out to eat dinner? And she says, oh, I can't. I'm fasting. It was a Saturday. Apparently, I wasn't around prior to that. I guess they didn't move fast days off General Conference weekend. And so that was what it was. And then she explained to me that, it was conference weekend. I didn't know anything about that. She told me what it was, or tried to tell me what it was. And I said, well, have you ever been there? She says, no, I've never been there in person. I said, well, would you like to go? And of course she said, yes, sure. So I said, well, tomorrow we'll go down to General Conference, which we did. And as we sat in the balcony right around the ridge, this is in the days when you didn't need tickets or, that sort of thing. And I'm watching people, see the choir up there. And as I sat there watching, this man came in from the side, walked across the stage, below the choir, sat down, and he had this white, wavy hair. And I thought to myself, he must be somebody special. Well, you know who it was?
David O. McKay.
What?
David O. McKay.
David O. McKay. It's exactly who it was. The white hair gives it away every time, doesn't it? Yes. No, and so, but I was very impressed, and so we went, had a wonderful time. It was good, so forth. Now, as school started in the fall, Jean said, and there was another her good friend, the two of them, Jean and Judy, and they said to me one day, well, why don't you take an institute class? She said they have, classes on the New Testament and the life of Paul and all these things. You could take one of those classes. I said, well, no. I didn't have, they were always worried that I didn't have a life. And they were pretty close to correct. But, I said, well, what are you girls taking? Well, she said, we're taking church history, but that's because it's the only class that's offered during the noon hour. And that's the only time they had, they were working girls. So noon hour was the only time they can. They said, well, so I said, well, why don't I take that with you? When I was in college, those 4 years, I had to take a religion class every semester. So I graduated with a minor in religion, but it had one of those years was world religions. The instructor was horrible. And in that entire year, I never heard one word about the LDS Church. Never mentioned that at all. He specialized in these weird little isolated types of religion in Asia and so forth. But he was popular because you didn't have to do a whole lot to get a grade. And the athletes would always come in there in the back and sit in the back row, and they didn't have to do anything. And even if they were having problems, if they went in to see him and said, "Oh, I've got to have a C at least, or a B," he just gave it to them, and it was a wasted year. We had to also attend, and I was at that Lutheran school. We had to attend a religious program every morning in the auditorium, and you were assigned seats, and they had checkers. People had their sections, so that they had a list of who was in these seats and when they weren't there. Now you can imagine how many people bribed somebody else to sit in their seat. That was a very common thing. So as we let's see what. Now we got to go back to at the same time that the classes started. This young man that introduced me to the girls said, I wonder, he said, would you, if I gave you this book, and this is the very book, I might add, would you read it? And I said, well, I didn't have anything else to do, so I did, and I read it every night. When I went to bed, I would read some from it every night. So it was this copy of the Book of Mormon, which I first thought, as I started, I said, I'll read it, but it'll be fiction to me, But it didn't take more than just a very few pages before I realized that there's something to this. This is serious business we're talking about here. So, and that's where that came from. So we, I took the class with the girls in church history, and we had a textbook to read, and which I did. And apparently I was the only one in the class because I got the high mark in every test. They used to give tests at this, and I'd always get the high marks. And she said, "How can you do that?" She's, I said, "Because I read the book. I read the stuff. I do my homework." And, it's not for a big secret, but it was very helpful that taking that class, and that led us to we took that class together for the whole year. But the first day was an interesting one. At that time, USU, it's still probably the same thing, did not allow smoking in the buildings. So anybody who smoked, and I was never a smoker. I was brought up not to smoke. It's a very conservative family. We didn't go to movies, we didn't smoke, that sort of thing, went to our church meetings. So that first class, we went out to the door, I lit up a cigarette. And Jane's telling me this later, she was just, said, it was so embarrassing. She says, "Here we are walking to Institute class with a guy who's smoking. How can that, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense." So she said, she didn't know what to do, but she said, "Bet you couldn't quit smoking." And I said, "Bet I could. I've done it many times." Because smoking was mostly in graduate school when trying to see who could quit smoking the soonest and give it up, and we'd make a bet, and I always won the bet. And after a while, somebody else wanted to do the same thing. So it wasn't a heavy thing for me. So I said, I bet I can. So I reached into my pocket and took out my half a package of cigarettes and gave it to her. And she put it in her purse. She had a little purse that she put it in. And that was the last time I saw a cigarette. Well, I smoked a cigarette. It wasn't the last time I saw that half package of cigarettes, however, because many years later, she came across that purse down in a storage bin or something, and when we were living in Logan, and there was that half pack of cigarettes that had been there all that time. So the class was wonderful, I thought. It was very, very interesting and enlightening, and the instructor was wonderful, and he was just like another father to me. Every day after class, he would call me and said, "Now, do you have any questions you want to have answered on today's, this material?" And if I had questions, he'd just answer them, and it was really very wonderful. So it wasn't very long before I realized that this is an important book, and there's more to this religion than most people would have you believe. So I began to study and pray, and by this time my parents knew that I was taking this class, and they were very worried. And the Lutheran pastor's wife, I still had that letter here just a while ago from old things, sent me the hardest letter, the meanest letter that I think I've ever received. Saying how terribly disappointed everybody was in me, because I was thinking about joining the Mormon Church. And so it was a rough time. So I'd go home every night and pray, and just pray hard. And I didn't seem to be getting anywhere. I had that stupor of thought, not an answer to my question. So this kept going. Now we're into January, and one night when I finished my prayer, my reading and my prayer, and I went to bed, and I thought I was awake, or maybe I dreamed I was awake. I don't know what it was. But a month before I came out to Logan, one of my grandmothers died, and I was a pallbearer at her funeral. So this particular night, all of a sudden, up in the corner of the room, I saw my grandmother. And she said, "Remember, it's your decision." That's all she said. We talked later, Jean said, "Why didn't she say, join the church, it's true?" She would, no, but that's what she said. And as soon as she said that, I realized that I was worrying, bearing that burden of my parents. And as soon as I realized that it was my decision, I knew what my decision was already. I was going to join the church. It's like getting a big burden off your shoulders. So the next morning I went down to S.E. Needham's Jewelry in Logan and bought a diamond ring. It wasn't quite all smooth sailing from then, however, because we studied together every night, virtually every night we studied together. So I knew who I wanted to marry, and she's got this duo here she has to worry about. Me and the missionary. I felt bad about that because it was, I could put myself in his place. I would feel terrible, I guess. So, I went down. We went to a movie that night. It was in January, so it was wet. We had coats and so forth. As we were in the movie, I was holding the coats, and somebody wanted to get across to the seats on this side, and they said, they didn't say anything. Gee, I'll fall down here if I don't be careful. They wanted to get through, and so I stood up to let them through, and her coat slipped to the floor of the theater, which is, what's on the floor of a theater. And Jean, she's telling me this later now. She said, "I couldn't believe you let my coat fall on the ground, and you kept on, and yours didn't." So that was, that kind of took the wind out of my sails for that date, which was supposed to be a pretty important one. But it still wasn't all that happened. We went for a drive and we're talking. That very day, she had gotten a letter from her missionary in South Africa. And she said, I just feel terrible because he's feeling so terrible. But, so I'm, in my mind, they're saying, well, I picked the wrong night. I said, pretty sure of that. But we talked a little more. We drove up to the Logan Temple and sat and talked in the parking lot there. And things cleared right up, and I asked her, and she immediately said yes. But now I still hadn't joined the church, but I was getting ready to. So when you had to be with missionaries, full-time missionaries, before you could be baptized, well, to teach and so forth. Well, I had been taught by many people, and but I met with them because that was the rule to get permission, and was baptized. So on February 6th, 1960, I was baptized in the Logan Tabernacle, and the baptizer was the institute teacher, and and the rest is history. We went back to Iowa State. Well, that's an interesting little problem. Here we were getting married, and I couldn't go through the temple, couldn't be married in the temple, you know, the year's wait. So she says, you know, well, I've got to be married in the temple. So we said, well, let's talk to our bishops and stake presidents. And I talked to my bishop, who was a university professor that I knew, because I was assigned to a university stake. I was single and so forth. She talked to her bishop. I talked to my stake president. She talked to her stake president. She talked to her brother, who was a bishop in the university ward, who later performed the marriage for us. But all of them said basically the same thing. And her stake president said, well, just go down to Salt Lake City and go to the church office building and say you want to talk to the general authority, which you could do in those days, which we did. And his answer was exactly the same answer that all these other guys have said. Get married now, go back, finish up your degree, and come back to you know, and be married in the temple. And she wanted to be sure it was married on exactly the same day. She didn't want 2 anniversaries. But we were able to work that out, and it did work out. So that was the story. You know, the reason that they didn't want us to go back married, but to me to go back alone, for example, and then wait to come back to married, was I'd be going back to the same circle of friends, relatives, everything that I had before I came to Logan, and it would have been it was bad enough the way it was after we were married and when I went back, because they were quite, but I'm happy to say that my family accepted after a time, and they learned to love her. Well, not as much as I did, but we still, my sister, who calls me every week now, after Jean died, she calls to make sure I'm still alive or something, I guess. And but she always says, you know, that's her favorite sister-in-law. Well, it's my favorite wife too, so. So, I just wanted to give you the knowledge, now so that you know that I know that this is the Lord's church. I have had the opportunity now, let's see, when I joined in 1960, so 40, 60, 63 years ago, and a lot has happened. I've had the opportunity of serving in a whole bunch of callings, and we were able to serve 2 full-time missions and 3 or 4 small part-time missions. We have produced, I was going to show you, we had 5 daughters. The oldest one died while we were still in Ames. So after we were married in the temple, we went back and I had to finish up my degree. It took me about a half a year to do that. And she was very sick, and they thought she was going to die. Didn't tell me that, but they told other people who told me. So we had to rush back to Logan as soon as we had buried our daughter there in Ames. Later we had her body moved back to Logan, and that's why we bought our own plots. So she's now buried right beside her daughter, and I'll be right beside her. So I know that this is the Lord's church. I know the gospel is true. It's such a blessing in my life. It brought so much change into what I had been used to, and I know that God lives and that Joseph Smith truly was a prophet. That year of church history was a clincher for me, for Joseph Smith, and the early things that happened in this dispensation. And I know President Nelson is the prophet of the Lord. I'm so glad for him, and I'm glad for the organization that brings out such nice young ladies like this. And I appreciate, I didn't realize we had this many young ladies in our ward. I guess I never had them together to count them. And I appreciate you and your leaders and our leaders. And I bury that testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.